I'm Simon Knott. I'm a principal of BKK Architects and a broadcaster, and I think probably a number of you have sort of seen me around in a number of different guises. And I'm really proud to be hosting this event today. And I've done this for the last couple of years, a joint initiative between the Australian Institute of Architects, AILA, the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, and the Planning Institute of Australia, PIA. And it's a really great way and shows the fantastic, great way of talking about architectural and urban and landscape issues all together, and shows really the collegiate nature of our profession here in Melbourne, and that these bodies can come together and produce these really exciting events. But I'd firstly just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today, where we're located. Normally it would be the Wurundjeri people here at the M Pavilion behind us, which has always been located on one of the most important Wurundjeri meeting places in Melbourne. So, and it's always been a fundamental part of the whole M Pavilion program. But as we're not there directly at the moment, we'd like to pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating today in the webinar, but also pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters of Victoria and Australia. The talk today, you know, I mean, 2020, I mean, how do you describe it? And I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is this idea of being disconnected and connected. And I think it is, you know, a sort of fundamental part of our practice is that, you know, architecture and urbanism is about people. It's not about things. It's actually not about objects, even though we design objects and we design parts of our built environment. Architecture doesn't really exist without the people that make it happen, and actually the connection between people that is facilitated by those professions, by the professions we're representing today. And I think in a year when we've been absolutely disconnected and locked down, particularly here in Victoria, for so long, it is, you know, rather ironic. I think that, you know, I personally, and I know this for a number of people, have felt more connected to their communities than ever before. And whether it's friends on, you know, WhatsApp groups together, or, you know, Zoom parties, or whatever you're doing, to friends, you know, neighbours bring around, you know, loaves of sourdough bread, or dropping in meals, or checking on the elderly neighbours. I think, you know, we have really one really positive thing that's come out of a really kind of horrible year has been the idea that we of community, and how much we need people, and how much that connection to community and engagement are more important than ever. So enough from me. I'm going to get on and pass over to our guests. First over to Esther and then Meredith, who are going to introduce themselves and then talk for 10 minutes or so each. And then we're going to have a really lengthy time for some Q&A. So it's not just all about people talking to you. You've got an opportunity to really participate in this, and we hope to generate some discussion. So there's a Q&A function there. So don't use the chat. If you can use the Q&A function and post some questions into that, and we'll get to them at the end. So over to you, Esther.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Esther Charlesworth, and I'm a Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT and the founding Director of Architects Without Frontiers. So in addressing the theme Connection as Antidote, today I'll explore the role of design in dealing with some of the intractable global challenges of our time. I'll do this from drawing from experience in leading Architects Without Frontiers over the last 2 decades, and also case studies from my forthcoming book, Design for Fragility, 12 Stories of Humanitarian Architecture. So we're now confronted, as Simon said, by the increasing spectacle of widespread disasters compounded by pandemics, ecological vulnerability and social fragility. What is the role for design amidst such flux? After having lived and worked in conflict zones from Bosnia to Beirut since 1996, I see that the demand is now urgent for us to respond to the design and planning challenge of rebuilding cities, sites and landscapes affected and often destroyed by the combination of conflict, sea level rise, political instability, social inequality, poverty and disease. The number of people displaced around the world today now totals almost 100 million people. And if counted as a nation, they would represent the world's 15th largest country. In Australia alone, 13.6% of the population live below the poverty line, and many without a decent roof overhead. So these political, health and social vulnerabilities all have spatial implications. Design is, however, still often seen by the public as an exclusive art for the 1 to 10% of the population that can afford it. It's profiled in Cynthia Smith's landmark book, Design for the Other 90%. So my argument here is not that we all quit our day jobs in design or run off to the next conflict or disaster zone to produce another prefab structure, but to consider, as the late Paul Falleros and even Shigur Rahban did, that pro bono architecture is not antithetical to great or even award-winning architecture, that by giving back, in fact, you expand your design frontiers and business, that it's a useful tool in getting projects off the ground that would not otherwise not see the light of day. However, I do not see it as a mechanism for giving away every stage of design and construction services for free. So design for fragility expands this nascent but growing field of what I call humanitarian architecture by exploring different case studies of design responses to displacement and disaster, illustrating new models for design practices, often merging commercial and pro bono design practice. So the theory is all well and good, you may well ask, but where are the projects? So Design for Fragility, again, profiles diverse case studies from Kununurra Courthouse to Rural Studios' $20,000 houses in Alabama to camp planning for the Rohingya in Bangladesh. However, in the interest of time today, I'll just profile 2 projects and briefly touch on the source of fragility for each, the design response, or as the antidote, and the collective impact of the project. So the first project I'll talk about is just behind you. It's a maternity waiting village in Malawi by the MASS Design Group. MASS stands for a model of architecture serving society. And MASS are known for their public health expertise and ability to combine a really interesting tripartite business platform of for-profit, not-for-profit, and research. And this award-winning maternity waiting village project highlights the chronic challenge of maternal mortality. And in 2010, about 1 in 30 women died from pregnancy or delivery, largely from preventable causes. MASS worked with doctors, nurses, sociologists, and expected mothers at the facility to propose a new prototype, this waiting village. Built of locally sourced materials, the new design broke the singular block concept of the existing prototype into a series of smaller compounds that you see here, clustered around small courtyards. But what's most interesting about the project to me is that post-occupancy studies have demonstrated that this new village prototype has reduced both maternal and infant mortality and increased family income and well-being through designing safe spaces for expectant mothers and their families. So in summary, MASS Group's abilities to build an architecture of evidence is not mutually exclusive of an architecture of excellence. And evidence-based design, as they talk about, is not just reserved for engineering, medicine, or science. Too many lives, as we see in this project, frankly depend on it. The second project that I will touch on, and just behind you today, is the Quarter Trove Women's Resource Centre, or the Al Tadra Dreaming Project in Savu Savu, Fiji, by Architects Without Frontiers. Now, I see that this project exemplifies many of the chaotic series of factors that 2020 has now normalised and that many of us in the not-for-profit sector face. From Cyclone Winston to other health epidemics to embezzlement by an admin officer who then burnt down the project office. We kind of saw it all. And now, luckily, the Great Hall building, of which I'm sitting technically within, is now complete and rises high above the hill in Savu Savu as a structure reminiscent of a pitch bure. Funded by DFAC, this project is very much a collaborative project, but between the women, rural women of Corcadrove and Architects Without Frontiers. It was very much client rather than donor driven. The project again is dealing with so many inherent fragilities, a lack of land tenure, a deeply patriarchal society. The project is also sited within a Pacific locale that has one of the highest levels of domestic violence in the Pacific. So the building is much more than a community centre per se. It's a women's refuge, a business and a craft trading floor. Adi Kabu, one of the driving forces behind the project, remarked to me, "The project is a dream for us as a meeting place for women and to generate income, to give us space to be. Normally architects are so very expensive that we didn't think that this project could happen, but you realised our mission, our vision and our dream." So yes, designing the hardware, the building is essential, but so is the software that is generating the projects and supporting the organisations that are not based on the FIFO, fly in, fly out, Western white expert model, but are rather based, working with local communities on site and design and project management professionals within the premise of generating livelihoods, gender equality, and Indigenous rights. So wrapping up, and decades after my first immersion into cities divided by conflict, again, we might well ask why the current disasters of pandemics, poverty, fire, floods, and typhoons should concern the design profession. Because we're human, because great architecture can work with complex issues and disciplines in often a mediating role. The poverty does not exclude aesthetics. If we distance ourselves and our spatial practices from the big global challenges of our time with the line, I'm just an architect, I'm just a landscape architect, we become part of the problem. So it's not always a question of where are your ethics, but where is your humanity? So deep ethical agency, I think, reaches a point of saying, I want this to come into the world and we'll bring this about. So yes, if we see design as an antidote, as a tool to counteract the disruptive challenges of our time, we can move forward as a discipline, as a profession, and as educators. And I'll just conclude with a few thoughts from Michael Murphy from the Mass Design Group about why architecture matters. It matters because without it, then we wouldn't actually be able to protect lives. We wouldn't actually be able to maybe save lives. We wouldn't actually be able to argue for the rights which are accessed by better breathing buildings. The right to breathe, the right to live a life where you can breathe fresh air. I believe that great design is human right. We have a right not just to housing, but to purposeful housing that serves everyone's needs. We have a right to healthcare spaces that don't make us sicker. We have a right to a public realm that provides for the needs of a community and that doesn't hinder or injure us. Design, he mentions, needs to situate us not as a nice to have, but a must have. Not as beauty that some people can afford, but as a foundational part of a functioning society. That without it, society doesn't function as effectively. So, Lalama Yani, or regards to all, as my colleague in the back of the image here emailed me from Fiji today. Unlike her, I wish everybody a great working remainder of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Esther. We can't have a pause really, but we can. I don't know. Thanks for that. It does look like you're in some tropical paradise there. So very, very envious. But well, thank you for that. And look, I won't, there's lots of good things to talk about there, but we'll hang on to them till later. And please, as we're going, feel free, people, to post things in the Q&A down the bottom of your screen. We will come to them at the end. So please do interact. And we'll head over to Meredith. Meredith Dobbie, thank you.
Thanks, Simon. My name is Meredith Daube. I have a science background. I'm a registered landscape architect, and I'm currently an adjunct senior research fellow at Monash Art, Design and Architecture. Esther spoke of her international work with Architecture Without Frontiers, illustrating connection as antidote. I want to bring our attention closer to home, to Melbourne and its suburbs, and particularly to a recent innovation, green infrastructure, which is changing both the appearance and the function of our urban and suburban landscapes. Green infrastructure uses nature-based systems that are managed to deliver ecosystem services to human communities. These systems can vary in scale, from small rain gardens to mid-sized green roofs to large wetlands, lakes and watercourses. Landscapes designed as green infrastructure are often multifunctional, providing opportunities for passive and active recreation, flood mitigation, and habitat and shade. They can moderate the heat island effect, improve water quality of rivers and creeks discharging to Port Phillip Bay, and recharge local aquifers. They help green Melbourne and contribute to its visual appeal. Green infrastructure supports connection in many forms as antidote to many ills. Connection can be between people and their suburban landscapes, between people and natural systems. Connection can be within the green infrastructure, providing habitat and connectivity for living and non-living components. Such connection can act as antidote to social isolation, to psychological and emotional stresses of our busy lives, to fragmented habitat, to overworked big pipe infrastructure, to displaced wildlife. This connection as antidote derives from the green infrastructure as managed natural systems. Green infrastructure has its most common application in sustainable stormwater management, and examples are all around us if we know what to look for. Let's look first, though, at how Melbourne has managed stormwater until recently, predominantly as a flooding risk. Elster Creek in Elwood is a great example. And in this presentation, I've drawn on a history of its drainage system published by Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works in 1979. So a map was drawn in 1852 showing that before white settlement, Elster Creek flowed from near current-day Wheatley Road, East Brighton, to a swamp that extended from around current-day Cochrane Street, Brighton, then northwesterly across to St Kilda Street and Glen Huntly Road, Elwood, to join Elwood Swamp north of Glen Huntly Road. Much of Elwood Swamp was below high tide level. A later map in 1893 shows a small creek running from Elwood Swamp to Port Phillip Bay. This creek was the only natural outlet for the Elster Creek catchment, which is about 40 square kilometres in size. Flooding was a constant problem as the suburbs developed around the swamp and the creek. The swamps themselves were physical barriers to development. They were often used as tips for domestic waste, including sewage. Not surprisingly, swamps were regarded as nuisances that had to be drained. Flooding in Elwood Swamp was exacerbated by construction of a drain in 1871 by Brighton Borough Council through Elstonwick Park to its municipal boundary at St Kilda Street, in response to a request from the Commissioner of Crown Lands to extend the drain to Port Phillip Bay. In 1873, St Kilda Council constructed the first iteration of the Elwood Canal. It was a ditch running from St Kilda Street, south of Glen Huntly Road, across swampy Murphy's Paddock in a west-northwesterly direction to cross Glen Huntly Road, where the existing canal commences. From there, the first canal followed a different course from the existing canal to enter Port Phillip Bay, about 150 metres closer to St Kilda. The drain was a 9-metre wide ditch between Levee banks, a bit over 24 metres apart, and a bit over half a metre high. Its bed was at low tide level and tidal to Glen Huntly Road. However, Elwood Swamp continued to be a problem. From 1888, the swamp was filled with material from Port Phillip Bay and dredging of the Yarra River, and a much larger canal was built from Glen Huntly Road to Port Phillip Bay, where it is today. This concrete canal, and it's the current one, is 16 metres wide at the top with vertical walls to low tide mark and then sloping walls 11 metres apart at the bed. Originally, the bed was about 1.5 metres below low tide level. In 1904, siltation led to it being filled to about 0.3 metres above low water level and paved with brick and concrete. The canal's design included mooring points for small boats. The drain from Glen Huntly Road to St Kilda Street, Elwood, which was installed in 1873, remained where the current right-of-way is between Glen Huntly Road and Wave Street until 1904. It was replaced by a grass channel about 40 metres wide and a bit under a metre deep between Levee banks with a central bluestone paved dry weather flow channel. Its course changed to now run from Glen Huntly Road to St Kilda Street, parallel to Tide Street and Spray Street, and still there. The drain then continued in a narrower channel from St Kilda Street to the railway line near Garden Vale Station, and this is known as the Elstonwick main drain. The grass channel of this drain could not accommodate increasing flow as subdivision proceeded within the catchment and the drainage systems upstream improved. It required constant maintenance and was not consistently effective. The area of the reclaimed swamp continued to flood. In 1955, flow from the drain at New Street, Brighton, was diverted by underground pipes directly to Port Phillip Bay at Elwood Beach. In the 1960s, the grass channel of Elster Creek from New Street to the railway line at Garden Vale Station was replaced with a concrete channel in which Elster Creek now flows to Mackie Grove, East Brighton, where it joins the Moorabbin main drain. The creek continues in name within an underground rectangular drain constructed in 1975 with an open floodway reserve above serving as parkland, and this drain runs to the creek's source at Wheatley Road, East Brighton. So the present day form of Elster Creek reflects the values and technology of the time at which its management undertook the particular drainage works. A huge concrete canal controlling flow into Port Phillip Bay in the late 1800s, draining nuisance swamps, a grass channel in the early decades of the 20th century, a concrete channel in the 1960s, and underground pipes in the 1970s. It also expresses the relationship of humans to the natural environment, one in which humans attempt to dominate nature. And this relationship again is changing, and green infrastructure is its manifestation. Flooding continues to be a problem in Elwood as a consequence of its location on a former swamp and the increased demand on the stormwater drainage system upstream, within that 40 square kilometre catchment, as the area of impervious surfaces increases with continuing urban development. Green infrastructure for stormwater management encompasses a range of nature-based mechanisms, including rain gardens, wetlands, bioswales, and green roofs. Green infrastructure has been proposed as a component in the Elster Creek Action Plan, developed just in the last year, by a working group of representatives of Melbourne Water, the Regional Drainage Authority, and the 4 local councils that lie within the Elster Creek catchment. For example, wetlands are proposed for Elstonwick Park North. Wetlands act as sponges to absorb increased water flows after storms. They also treat the water naturally, removing contaminants that might pollute Port Phillip Bay. They provide habitat and opportunities for passive recreation, and they can also be beautiful. Rain gardens are also likely to be constructed in Elwood and surrounding suburbs. And you might have unknowingly walked past rain gardens in your own suburban streets. These are shallow basins with very specific soil types, planted with a variety of plants, but often strappy-leaved. They are designed in tandem with the design of the road to take the runoff from the road and hold it in the basin. The rain garden retains the water, reducing the immediate influx of stormwater to the existing grey infrastructure. Over time, the water passes through the soil of the rain garden and contaminants in the water are removed by the soil and the plants. The water then passes into the stormwater system, or it may percolate into the groundwater. Rain gardens reduce the flow of the stormwater, mitigating flooding, and increase its quality, thereby reducing pollution in the bay where the stormwater is discharged. The rain gardens also improve the appearance of the street, providing greenery. Some rain gardens have trees, which are irrigated by the captured stormwater, and those trees improve the appearance of the street and provide shade. The rain gardens can increase local biodiversity, serve as habitat, and provide connection with nature for urban dwellers. Retrofitting green infrastructure into an existing catchment can be a challenge. Less restrictive is implementation of green infrastructure in greenfield developments. You might have noticed that all new residential developments in Victoria now include wetlands. The Victorian planning scheme requires that stormwater is held within a subdivision and treated on site to reduce the sediment load and phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations to specified levels. Wetlands provide this service. The water can then be harvested for reuse or discharged to nearby watercourses. Sited within public open space, they also provide many other benefits, including habitat, contributing to the livability of the place. Green infrastructure is not a replacement for big pipes infrastructure. Green infrastructure complements grey infrastructure. Nevertheless, it provides many more services, well beyond simply draining stormwater. It can be part of an integrated water management system and contribute an alternative water source, relieving demand on our potable water supply. Well-designed green infrastructure can provide patches of nature within our city with all the benefits that nature is known to confer on humans. Undoubtedly, connection as antidote is amongst them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Meredith. And I think it was great. I was just following that on Google Maps as you're talking. And it's a kind of rich little part of Melbourne through there, isn't it? On quite a short space of time, short area. I think, look, all of us would certainly, no matter where you live in Melbourne during the last, particularly this year, have appreciated whatever little piece of greenery, urban green infrastructure that they can find. I mean, do you think this will help? Do you think this year will help accelerate the development of these spaces? Because it does take, to go from, looking through that, and it is a concrete culvert, for large bits of it, or even undergrounded. Do you think it does take a number of years, in fact, to get that back to any kind of resemblance of perhaps where it was, even if that's possible? Do you think this year will sort of accelerate the desire for that to happen both within the community and within councils?
You'd think so, because I think this year has encouraged people, compelled people to get to know their local area much more intimately, and the absence of readily accessible green space must be very striking in some areas. And yet, under Melbourne, there are any number of kind of barreled creeks which I guess have the potential to be naturalised, brought to the surface. It's certainly a major undertaking and requires a huge commitment on the part of the authorities to do. But it is being done. There's one up in I think it's called Small Creek in Ipswich, and it's been sort of naturalised or brought back to the surface, and albeit it's a constructed natural system, it still functions as a natural system, and over time, the biodiversity will increase. But it has multiple benefits that people really, I think, perhaps are only now starting to realise, given the restrictions of the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, well, I think you do. What this year has really forced us to appreciate, what are the most important things in our lives, and certainly people and connection to people is one, but connection to outdoors and to getting out into sort of decent public space is the other. I think they're the two fundamental things, and probably food might be the third.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of research that shows that humans actively need contact with nature. It's not some kind of add-on that is nice to have. It's an inherent need of the human species to have connection with nature. And in our increasingly dense cities, that access is more difficult. And there need only be little patches of nature to derive the restorative benefits of that contact.
Well, I think we'll at least it should improve the pressure to kind of maintain these spaces at least, or if not return them or kind of naturalise them to some degree. And I'm lucky enough to live right on Mary Creek here, and was just an absolute saviour during the lockdown. And we get the wonderful thing with a big tree outside of our bedroom window, and a powerful owl comes into it, and we get this enormous kind of a powerful owl kind of at night. It's the most wonderful thing to kind of fall asleep to. So hopefully, and you can see as you kind of cycle along the creek too, over time it's gone from being the backyard tip to people kind of starting to open up their properties onto the creek and actually start to turn their houses around. I think the more we see the architecture starting to kind of address into those spaces, the more people start to value them, the more people look after them. And, we get lots of people around us going and picking up trash and rubbish and things out of the creek just to kind of keep it at a...
Well, certainly, there's been other research to show that property values increase if it's in close proximity to green infrastructure. It increases, something like 10 or 12%, and it need only be within, a couple of hundred metres of the green infrastructure. So, there are these other benefits that can accrue as a consequence of reinvesting in green infrastructure.
It's a no-brainer, really, isn't it? Esther, can I just ask you? I know it's obviously a bit of a bugbear of yours, and I've kind of spoken to you about this over a long period of time now. In Architectures Without Frontiers, is the sort of dichotomy that seems to exist between this sort of idea of what is architecture and what is this kind of pro bono work or this other kind of community work, and they're kind of not seen as the same thing. And it seems like everything you spoke about then could be invested in some way, even into private development in architecture, or something you're building in a set of apartments, as much as it is to a community building in the Pacific somewhere. Why do you think architects find it so difficult to kind of bring those two things together? I mean, not all, and I think there's a lot of good architects out there trying to do good work in the cities as much as they do within other communities. But why do you think that dichotomy exists?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, we now have 13 network partners in Architects Without Frontiers. who underwrite our administrative costs. So they represent Hassel, Hable, Cox, SJB, quantity surveyors, Tract, because their staff are saying we need to get involved in these projects, we need to do something. I'm hearing that from students at RMIT. So I guess it's a supply and demand thing, in that the built environment sector, perhaps unlike law or medicine, where it's needed as part of your continuing professional development, you need to do pro bono work. You don't in architecture. So I think it's what I guess I was trying to say in the talk, and I think was really represented through Paul Falleris's practice, who did fantastic houses on the northern beaches of Sydney, but also, you know, activated a system that enabled Indigenous people to sort of rebuild their own houses, you know, tens of thousands of houses. It's not an either or. And I think the Mass Design Group have really shown this, that they, as I said in my talk, that they have a for-profit, you know, large part of their business are not-for-profit and a research section. And I think other people like Brian Bell, who sort of forged the public design movement in the US, sort of says that by doing these projects, it kind of, I mean, he's more capitalistic about it, sort of says it actually leads to paid work. So, I mean, some people would say that, you know, doing architecture competitions is pro bono, in that you're giving all this time and sort of intellectual property over sort of to this. So I don't think, as I said, it's not a sort of either or proposition. We know Shiguru Ban's private work because of his humanitarian work. He probably wouldn't have a profile so much if we didn't know about, you know, his sort of paper log construction. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting time. And as I said, it's not, when I got involved in this area in the mid-1990s and I sort of came back to Australia and was talking about these things, people would just sort of yawn and be incredibly bored, and just say sort of, when are you going to get a real job? I mean, I had worked in practice for 12 to 15 years and then sort of in government and urban design. So I'd sort of been there and sort of done that for you know, a period. So yeah, I think it's an interesting time, not so much as an ideological one, as a sort of supply and demand issue from the broader built environment sector and from the next generation of design students.
Yeah, I mean, it is an attitudinal thing, isn't it? And I remember talking to you when we did the radio show, you know, back in early 2000s, and you know, Architecture Without Frontiers, when you started that, and it was kind of like this thing. Well, isn't that just for doctors, or you know, like it kind of, you know? And I think, you know, it was always Robin Boyd's, you know, his whole pitch with the small age home service and other things was to, you know, we should be doing pro bono work, and lawyers do it and other professions do it, and it should be a fundamental part of the profession. And I agree with you. I mean, I think our attitude to it has been, the more generous you are in practice, the more it comes back to you, and it comes back to you in spades. I think, you know, the more generous you are in the things that you do within your larger community, whether it's just in architecture or just in the community itself. I think it's not just a noble thing. It's not something to just feel good about. It actually has real consequences for your own practice if you take on these.
Well, it's also interesting because I was speaking to Shanine Fanton yesterday, who runs people-oriented design in Cairns, because I'm profiling one of her projects, a brain injury project in Cairns. And she works there with an architect, landscape architect, sort of Belinda. And they said that since the cyclone in northern Queensland, they've never had so much work in all of their lives. And because, again, they've specialised the remit of their practice in somewhat, as much as you can do in far north Queensland, that they cannot keep up with sort of the requests for projects, for paid projects, but sort of one part of it. So again, it's sort of, yeah, an interesting time. And I think the better projects all have this sort of interdisciplinary input of landscape architects, urban planners and economists. I think when it's, again, just the kind of capital A architect kind of flying in, fly out, which I've seen across the world firsthand, from Haiti to Sri Lanka to Eastern Japan, it's kind of a huge problem. But I was interested separately in your talk, Meredith, because I live very close to the area that you're talking about. And Simon, I used to live on Mary Creek. So I felt that in my head, in my emotion, I was kind of with you in Mary Creek and then sort of with you in St Kilda. So Simon, I might just address, if it's okay, one of the questions that sort of come up here. Is okay?
I was about to throw. Yeah, just before you do, can I just say to people again, remind them, if you we've got a little bit of time left. We've got another sort of 10, 15 minutes or so if we want. Feel free, if you've got any questions at all at anything we're discussing here, just throw it into the Q&A down the bottom of your screens, and we'll surely come to it. So yeah, Esther, there was a question there. Do you have any Australian examples of projects within our Indigenous Australian communities?
Yes, we've done 5 projects. Only the first one was built, which was rebuilding the home of an Indigenous elder, Uncle Dennis, on North Stradbroke Island about 14 years ago, and getting him on the grid because he lived at 1 mile that was never sort of connected to services under the sort of apartheid system that happened under Joe Bajelki in Queensland. And we've done other projects in Oenpelli, Wadia. More recently, we've been working with Hassel and another range of consultants in Maningrida on an Indigenous artefacts project and women's textile centre. So that's been a more sort of recent project. Unfortunately, only one of them has come to fruition, but yes, you know, we have, not in Victoria, but we've been more recently in discussion with Aboriginal housing to see how we might perhaps collaborate with them. So interesting question.
I'm going to read this out because it's quite a long one for you, Meredith. Meredith, thanks for your great presentation. There's a great need to embrace and expedite green infrastructure along our waterways in suburban Melbourne with urban developments. I live in Gardeners Creek catchment in Whitehorse, and we have been fighting to preserve our much neglected Gardeners Creek from inappropriate development. The walkways, an increased love of our creek, have been our community saviour as well during the COVID lockdown. We have objective fatigue in our community with respect to inappropriate developments along our creek. Do you have advice for us to how best communities can improve and protect their local environment?
That's always very difficult, isn't it? I think the important thing is to have a voice, but of course, sometimes if the voice isn't what the person, you know, or the authority to whom that voice is speaking doesn't want to hear it, that voice just becomes a nag, and then it's so easily ignored. I guess it would have to rely on numbers. I think, you know, if you get enough people who just say, no, this isn't how we want to live. We don't want our place to change in this way. It's very hard for the authorities approving what are, you know, these perhaps inappropriate developments to ignore that call. Except, well, there's legislation. So maybe, you know, the people up in the Gardeners Creek catchment should have a look at the recent legislation so that developments, pretty well all developments, there are very few exclusions, are required to meet stormwater guidelines. And those guidelines are to protect neighbouring waterways, such as in the Gardeners Creek. That would be one aspect. I suppose, is there concern sort of around water quality of the creek, the potential for flooding as a consequence of increased development, or is it more sort of the aesthetic aspect, just the unattractive, you know, appearance of often visually inappropriate development particularly in a watercourse? I mean, you only need to look at some of the development along the Yarra, you know, as you're going upstream. I
guess it's probably all of those things, Meredith, I suspect.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, certainly, you know, along here on Merry Creek and along the Yarra. In fact, the Yarra is pretty well protected, sort of down towards where we're. They're pretty wealthy, I think, and sort of band together well. But you know, it's no surprise that developers, you know, see the opportunity in green infrastructure as much as anybody else, and you know, are crowding to kind of get into those spaces, you know, adjacent to those bits of green infrastructure. Well, you know,
yeah, because you know, the sad reality is that real estate is more valuable where it abuts a watercourse. So Yeah, I guess it really is around lobbying and the hope that you find developers, and there are out there developers who are more sympathetic to the environmental values of their sites and the desire to have more sort of aesthetically and environmentally appropriate development in those more sensitive areas.
There's a question here from Brad, who said he was interested to hear about the powerful owl outside your window, Simon, but he wanted to know about the wildlife, where the wildlife sector sits when it comes to establishing green infrastructure and rewilding. And I assume it's as much a vital part of it as any sort of landscape.
Yeah. I think certainly in projects that I'm familiar with, ecologists are involved. You know, inevitably there's going to be an environmental study beforehand to have an understanding of what the current situation is, and then some kind of historic study to find out what was there before development, in order to set the groundwork to propose some, a new piece of green infrastructure. I guess I'm thinking about, naturalization of creeks or even the construction of a wetland. Because what's quite intriguing in a lot of the residential subdivisions is that these wetlands that are being put back in for the purpose of the stormwater management are in fact on sites where, wetlands, previously known as swamps and marshes, once were and have been drained to allow often agricultural use. So in those instances, ecologists are inevitably involved, environmental scientists and horticulturists, the whole suite of experts who bring their different skills together. There can sometimes be a bit of a tension between the pragmatism that some of these projects demand and the ecological values of the scientists working there. So it's sometimes the case that you can't really be quite a purist as an ecologist when you're designing these green infrastructure interventions. They have to function. They have to serve a function, be it stormwater treatment or sort of retention of stormwater, and so they have to meet certain, let's call them engineering requirements. The idea is to overlay that with the ecological dimension so that it does function as habitat.
Yeah, well, thanks, Meredith. And I think, look, there's lots to go into there, and I sort of, there's a whole. Hopefully, what we'll see is we start to move towards developments like build to rent, and some of even the social social housing infrastructure that's being built, in a huge program around that, where the developers are having a long-term ownership over the asset. We'll see greater investment in the surrounding fabric that they're building into, because they have a real interest in maintaining that in the longer term, rather than the sort of models we've had of development over the speculative models we've had over the last sort of 30 odd years or so, which I think have really harmed our natural and built environment enormously. I just wanted to, and on that vein, I just wanted to flick back to you, Esther, and I just wonder, look, we're talking there about, there's discussion there around, about pro bono work, and there's sort of or fully paid work. But one thing I imagine, this certainly has happened in our practice, is what happens when you do that sort of pro bono work and the more community minded work, is that starts to then infiltrate back very much into the way that you practice in the more fully paid development work, in a much more community minded way. You start to develop an attitude to the way you can, even if it's even at the smaller edges of those pretty hardcore development approaches, or any sort of council kind of work, or any project, in fact, where you can actually start to shift it and benefit the community more than the actual developer themselves or the client. Do you see that as a sort of benefit of kind of doing that sort of work?
Yes, although I don't think they're mutually exclusive. What I've learnt from my colleagues, the network partners, as I said, who support the organisation, or the people who lead, for example, Hassel, Cox, SJB, Hayball and Tract, is that they are incredibly community minded. They just wanted to sort of through all of their work and through all of their practice, we've just finished an upgrade of a women's crisis centre in Coburg. And Hayball were the architects there, and the project manager just sort of said yesterday that they treated it like one of their sort of top school projects. You know, in terms of the sort of design surface, it wasn't seen, oh, we'll do this in our spare time. And that's what sort of impresses me. I don't think I've got this sort of, or the organisation, we're not kind of going to save the world. We're not going to really tell people how to consult with communities or how to work in Indigenous communities or overseas. They kind of already know it. So that's what I'm sort of impressed by. And I guess it's more just that in some of these projects, as I spoke about with the mass design, is where you can build an evidence base for a project, as Paul Falleros did with Health Habitat. He was able to get hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal funding to support his project. So it's because he could say, I've fixed 200,000 houses that have led to, you know, a livelihood increase in X, that have led to an improvement in health and education. So I think numbers do count. And I think this is also relevant to Meredith's really interesting green infrastructure project. As she said, you know, real estate rises, where you can sort of, not always, but bring in a metric. You know, if you can count it, it kind of matters. And I think that's what I've sort of learnt more from. It's all well and good to say that this project has helped this community. Well, how? How do we know, and how do you quantify that? And you can't always. It'd be much harder to do perhaps on residential projects. But when we're dealing with the very edges of society or margins, as we are dealing with generally, then that becomes really important in kind of getting funding, and I think is a more general lesson for design practice in general.
Yeah, well, it's good. It's a good point. I was very lucky to be involved with Paul Falleros on one of the best biennales we were both part of, and so I spent quite a bit of time with him. He's an incredible man. So yeah, and did some amazing work, and I think, you know, you've seen it. You know, you can see it with people here like Jeremy McLeod from Breathe Architects, who's really set on an agenda of kind of other, you know, kind of a more sort of inclusive way of practicing, and how that's benefited him in his own practice. And, you know, it has really boomed. So I think, and we certainly see it from our staff, and our interest is, you know, is actually doing projects that matter, you know, regardless of, you know, what the client base is, but with you know, people and most of our clients do as well, in fact. And I think even now, and especially now when projects are so architecture or landscape or any sort of project just takes so long to get off the ground and get going, you're often working on them for years. You want to be doing the projects that really make some change. So, you know, I think it's a good lesson for everyone. And I'm going to start to wrap it up here. I think we're getting close to 2 o'clock. So I want to thank you very much both for your time. Coach, I've just been flicking on, I've had a look earlier, and I've just been scrolling through it as we've been talking, but Mass Design Group, the one that Esther's put up, and it's there in the chat on the right there if you want to have a look at it. It's got some incredible projects, so please go there and have a look. Someone's come on and said, you know, it's important to connect with your local councillors who champion green infrastructure. That's a great way to do it. Most of those catchment, I know there's a really strong group here along Merry Creek and Save Merry Creek group, but there's a lot of local groups that will usually, you know, you can sort of help get onto, and they're driven from their community, so you know, they rely on people getting involved. So please do get involved. Yeah, I want to thank Meredith Dobbie. He's a landscape architect and adjunct senior research fellow at MATA. Thank you very much for your time today, and you know, great sort of chat about something I think we all value a lot more as a result of the time we've had this year. So, you know, green infrastructure and how much that's a part of our lives. So thank you. And also to Esther Charlesworth, who's the founding director of Architects Without Frontiers and academic director at the RMIT. I love the title of this, the Master of Disaster. It sounds like a Beastie Boys title.
Mod.
Disaster Design and Development. What a great! It's such a great time, a great term. So you can go and have a look at that. It's a course that a number of. It's well, maybe you want to just quickly give a plug.
Sure. The Master of Design, Disaster and Development. We're situated actually within the School of Landscape Architecture at RMIT. We have students from every background, not just design, in Australia, and internationally it was set up as an online degree with intensives, so you can do it from everywhere, anywhere, part-time, full-time. It's not just for people who work in the development sector, but to learn about sort of urban resilience, climate change mitigation, etc., etc. So anyone interested, please send us a message.
It sounds like it should be part of the fundamental part of the course anyway. So, but
That's
thank
what
you.
Rob Stanter said, actually.
I know Rob's done the course and a big champion of it. So thank you very much. And thanks everyone who's come. We kept along, everyone stayed on board for the full time too. So obviously riveted by the chat, and thank you. And thank you to AILA, Australian Institute of Architects, Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, and PIA, the Planning Institute of Australia, for putting this on again. Hopefully 2021 we'll be back here in the M Pavilion proper.